Welcome to In Conversation with MANWAR podcast. This podcast is brought to you by the Do Not Be a Bystander campaign. You can join us in raising awareness about bullying by visiting the donotbeabystander.com, and be sure to subscribe to the channel to stay informed about upcoming episodes. Today's participants are Shanza, Afza, and Faiza. Our special guest for today's episode is Trevor Fairweather.
Welcome to our Bullying Awareness Podcast. I'm your host, MANWAR. Today, I'm joined by three young individuals who are ready to share their thoughts and insights on the topic of accountability. Accountability refers to the responsibility of individuals, organizations, or institutions to answer for their actions, decisions, and behaviors. Today's participants are Shanza, Afza, and Faiza. Before we continue, I would like to introduce our special guest today's podcast, Trevor Fairweather.
Hello,
Trevor
how are you?
will shed some light today's topic and give some tips and advice to our participants and viewers. Trevor is a program director with strong track record in overseeing complex software and hardware projects. He excels in relationship buildings and leading teams to achieve success. A result-oriented individual who possesses strong public policy abilities through effective communication and management resources. Thank you, Trevor, for joining us today. Really appreciate it. Now that we have introduced our participants and guests, let's get started with our first question. Accountability plays an important role in personal and professional settings, shaping the way we approach our responsibilities and interactions. So, my question for Shanza is, what does accountability mean to you, and why accountability important in personal and professional setting?
Yes, so accountability is the act of taking responsibility for one's actions, decisions, and commitments. It is about being answerable to oneself and others for accomplishing specific tasks, meeting goals, and fulfilling obligations. Accountability is important because it builds trust and credibility, develops a sense of responsibility, ownership, and commitment, and many more. So ultimately, accountability helps to drive personal and professional success and promotes a sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in one's endeavors. Thank you. That's all.
Excellent. Thank you, Hans. Thank you for your answer, Shanza. So, do you feel you are accountable for your actions? Do you take accountability?
Yeah, I
Like,
do
if,
sometimes.
for example, if you make a mistake, do you tell people that, okay, yes, I take that as accountability. I made a mistake.
Yeah, I think I should inform others if I do make a mistake because if I make a mistake, then they can help me fix it.
Yeah. All right. Excellent. Thank you so much. So, building trust is not easy, but it is healthy and successful and healthy relationship. It is very important. So, my next question is for Afza. How does accountability contribute building trust in relationship?
Okay, so accountability plays a very crucial role in building trust in relationships, and it contributes to building trust in relationship by promoting reliability, transparency, effective communication, constancy in behavior, forgiveness, and mutual respect. And I think, yeah, you if you don't admit your mistakes, another person can be blamed for it, and it can cause a bad situation. So I think it is a very important, it plays a very important part in building trust.
Exactly. I agree with you. Thank you. So, accountability is a fundamental aspect of creating positive and productive work environment. Now, how can accountability contribute a positive and productive work environment?
Accountability can contribute to a positive and productive work environment in a few ways. Number one, when employees know what is expected of them and what they are to be accountable for, it creates clarity and minimizes understanding. When individuals are accountable for their actions, it establishes trust among members and then it opens a way for communication and a sense of reliability within the team. And when employees know they're going to be evaluated based on their performance, they are motivated to meet expectations. So accountability helps maintain high standards and improvement is continued. So
Excellent. Great answer. So, with the completion of our questioning, we move on to the final segment of this podcast. Now, I would like to invite our guest, Trevor, to share his thoughts and insights, give some tips and advice to our participants and viewer. Please, Trevor.
I noticed a lot of the answers for accountability related around the work environment. As a manager or director, you're accountable for all your staff. So it's not just you identifying yourself as making mistakes and to be proactive to what one said earlier, which was identifying the mistake so you can catch it earlier, potentially put a task back on course. You as a manager and arguably colleague have to identify when somebody else is giving you a task that is a mistake, or they think the task is done, but there are mistakes in it. That's because you still want the effort to be successful, regardless of effort. So some people, when you ask them whether it's a mistake or not, or if you're reviewing work and to identify a mistake, may not really notice that the mistake occurred. So, but it's you as a colleague, but also as a supervisor, manager, identifying, wait a minute, this isn't quite right. Mistakes happen all the time. Sometimes you didn't have the right information. Things change. You made the best decision at the time. Forward. Personal life, there's accountability. Relates to trust, integrity, all those types of comments earlier as relationships. If people can trust you to be accountable, they're more likely to work. The other component is what you see behind me, even though you made a reference to it, the Einstein curve. The value of what you see behind me is when I'm having conversations with colleagues, and it's an ongoing topic. You can pick up on a topic that is over here and thread it together as ongoing meetings occur, so you don't have to repeat what you said, or you can speed somebody up to the conversation. So the accountability is on knowledge transfer to make sure the conversation stays focused and people see the relationship to what was talked about over here versus what's over there. That's why you see arrows back and forth, is because in a half an hour, 45-minute conversation, people will say an individual soundbite, but they won't really necessarily integrate it in to the other topics that have been brought up in the previous conversations or even future conversations.
All right. Thank you, Trevor. And do you have anything else to add?
Most people will talk about accountability and they'll use some generalized soundbite, but a way to hold them accountable isn't necessarily to interrogate them. There's another step that you can use, and it's called a STAR method. So whenever you're answering a question or potentially trying to speak, giving an answer, try to think of it as a STAR method. So identify the situation. What was the task involved? What were the actions taken after that task? And then followed up with what were the results? And even if you answer a question and you want to be clear, so don't give an 8-second soundbite, there is no I in team as an example. When you say there's no I in team, Give the situation that people can identify with about what was the situation that it took a group to solve the problem. What were the tasks that you could not do without somebody's support or review? What were the actions taken from those tasks, and hence what were the results? So as an example, you just saw me say most of your answers were in the employment task, but there's also the personal task piece, which is the reason I identified it almost right from the answers. That's the reason I gave it as an example on the fly. Was here is the situation when I'm meeting with folks like you. I have a practical example behind me of this block sheet here was a meeting I had with a group. That meeting right behind me was the follow-up meeting. That meeting there was the third meeting. Down to the bottom there is the fourth. But you notice there's arrows connecting them. So what that does is describe the situation, the action and task. Sorry, the task that I took was making sure it's not like minutes or notes, but making sure people know the key point. The action is somebody can sit back and review the full picture and say, oh, what about that item over there? Or what's that over there? And people can have an ongoing interactive conversation. And then the results are essentially what you see from each meeting, the arrows as a demonstration of the result. You give an 8-second soundbite versus what I just did as a star method. What? That was 30 seconds versus an 8-second soundbite? But that 30 seconds was probably more valuable if you could have had practical examples behind it.
Oh, perfect. Great. Thank you so much. So just one question, Trevor. So I heard about this STAR method, STAR, STAR methods, and I want our participants, Shawza, Afza, and Faiza, search for that on Google. What is STAR methods when you're giving an interview? So my question for you, Trevor, this is not for only interview you are talking about.
Right. Yeah. The interview.
It's a
like,
daily life conversation. Sometimes.
Yeah, it's a conversation. Like you could argue that this is a conversation, right? Yeah. And you notice I gave you the answers.
No.
Mentally, I already had it structured in that STAR method to make it valuable to you. I didn't lean on an 8-second soundbite like accountability is odd. Oh no, 13 teams are not odd. They're about a team or anything that's like you see these memes on the internet. The problem with memes on the internet is they don't give the solid example so you can relate to it.
Right.
Whereas my communication style was I gave solid examples so people could relate. And you could tell that even with what's behind me, if this was an ongoing, more thoughtful meeting in the sense that it was 45 minutes, an hour, in which we had real problem solving occur, I am making sure the communication about what's said behind me is brought forward to the next meeting, is brought forward. And somebody on the third meeting over here may identify the point that was over here doesn't relate anymore. We probably should eliminate it because it's now a distraction, but they would have never thought of it because they didn't have the cue to identify to it.
Yeah.
And again, that's the accountability part, which relates to the mistake. But even though a mistake potentially was made over here about a point being brought in, that mistake may still be a correct statement at the time. But because the situation changed over 3 or 4 weeks, it's like, well, now we don't want to talk about it because it's either going to chew up more resources than required. We can deal with it later. It's not a priority. So there's reasons you can park it as an item to deal with.
Yeah.
Because one of the other things you have to navigate in any given situation is just because you're the loudest person in the room doesn't mean you're right.
No. Exactly.
And one of the things you as a colleague or arguably a leader of a group have to identify who is actually doing the work. And if the person who's not actually doing the work is not speaking up, that's first of all, essentially them not being accountable for providing leadership in their position. They just may be drowned out. And that's not necessarily their fault. But your accountability as the leader of building a relationship is you can think in the back of your head, and I'm going to pick on MANWAR, like MANWAR's the one actually doing the work here. Why did he not say anything during that meeting? So you identify that review mistake that I mentioned earlier. Wait a minute, the person who's doing the work isn't saying. So therefore, you can follow up afterwards. You don't necessarily know why he's not saying anything. Maybe he's sick. Maybe he's tired. Maybe he's distracted. This is a lower priority project for him. But again, all of those are things that you can follow up with to make sure their voice is actually being heard. Because if everybody else around the table, he's the one that's actually doing the work.
Yep. Excellent. No, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Trevor. That was a great insight. Do you guys have any questions for Trevor?
No, thank
No,
you.
thank you.
Thank you for the great advice.
You're welcome.
Perfect. So we have come to the end of our podcast. I would like to thank our participants, Shanza, Afza, and Faiza, and also thank you, Trevor, for joining us today.
Not a problem.
And it means a lot to me. Thank you so much for listening our today's podcast. Before we wrap up, I would like to remind our listeners that there are several resources available to help individuals dealing with bullying. The government of Alberta has a bullying helpline, which provides support and assistance to those who experience bullying, and that number can be reached at 1-888-456-2323. Bullying is a violation of human rights. Under no circumstances is bullying acceptable. As a community, we have a shared responsibility to take a stand against bullying and refuse to be bystanders. Thank you so much again for joining in conversation with Manwar Khan, and see you next week. Bye.